Run for Something launched with one goal: recruit and support young, diverse, progressive candidates who have the power to make a difference in their community.
It was my time to step up and run. I never thought I'd work in politics. I never thought I'd run for office, and I'm so proud and honored to have the support of our community.
3 years later, more than 1,000 candidates have shown us what it takes to lead, unafraid to speak up.
When it comes to personal decisions around someone's pregnancy, we should support them, we should honor them, we should love them, and we should make sure that conversation is between themselves, their chosen family, their doctor, and their God.
Unafraid to take on a challenge. Despite overwhelming odds, they've led the charge on climate change.
The Green New Deal truly came out of my conversations in rural Maine. It's about economic and job opportunity for our state.
On healthcare.
This issue is dire and people are dying right now because of these price increases. So yeah, we need an investigation.
Picking up the torch of women and LGBTQ trailblazers before us.
No child in the Commonwealth of Virginia and no person in the Commonwealth of Virginia should ever be afraid to be who they are.
And changing the face of our democracy, one election at a time. They're just getting started, and so are we. Run for Something is here to stay. Go to runforsomething.net to learn how you can join us.
Hi, everybody. This is Amanda Littman. I'm one of the co-founders and the executive director of Run for Something. I am so excited to be here for tonight's first of our summer series, our Armchair Chats. This is going to be something we run all summer long, every Wednesday night, 6 p.m. East Coast, 3 p.m. West Coast. Really intended to make sure people can get their questions answered by the experts. We're going to be live streaming this on Facebook. We'll be cross-posting this to Now This, and making sure that people really have a chance to ask some of the best people in the business your questions about how to run a campaign, how to communicate, and how to survive, and dare I even say it, thrive in this really tough environment. Before we get started, a couple housekeeping things. First, I want to thank our sponsors for this series. That includes Act Blue, AFSCME, Authentic Campaigns, Fireside, Claire and Stephen Crouppen, Onward Together, Yelp, Precision Strategies, and Planned Parenthood. This would not be possible without them. Second thing for housekeeping, we really want you to introduce yourself. So if you go to the chat over on the right-hand side of your screen, and make sure to change your settings to all panelists and attendees. You can send your chat to all panelists or all panelists and attendees. All panelists and attendees means everyone else will be able to see it. Please introduce yourself. If you're a candidate running for something, tell us what you're running for and where. If you're thinking about running, tell us that too. We want to be able to answer any and all questions on your mind. Third thing, before I introduce our speaker for this evening, is if you have a specific question, please do drop it in the Q&A function. It's on the bottom of your screen. Little Q&A, looks like little chat rooms. Please do ask through that. That way I'll make sure when we get to the Q&A that I don't miss it. If there are any questions at all about what's going on or about anything else related to Run for Something, please do shoot them in the chat. I know folks from our team are here to answer. I will make a preemptive apology for any background noise from my dog for barking. This is the times we live in. I'm sure you'll forgive. With that, I want to introduce our incredible speaker for this evening. You may know her from the Pete Buttigieg campaign. I know her from working together back in 2012 for Barack Obama's re-elect. She's done many incredible things between then and since. She's going to talk to us a little about communications and then answer us questions. Please meet Lis Smith.
Hey guys, my name is Liz, and as Amanda said, I most recently worked for Pete Buttigieg on his 2020 presidential campaign, but all in all, I've probably worked on about 20 campaigns all across the country at every level. I worked in blue states like New York and New Jersey, but also red states like Kentucky, West Virginia, Missouri, South Dakota, and I've helped elect Democrats at every level, from state legislature to county prosecutor to Congress to Senate to governor to president. And I'll apologize because I have some kitties here and one of them just piped up. So if you hear them, again, I have the same disclaimer as Amanda. But Yes, so I've gotten to work at every level of politics all across the country, and I'm so excited to join you guys today because I love the message of run for something, and for a few different reasons. One is, it seemed like in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, Republicans were really, really focused on building up their bench, not just at the top levels, but, people running for school board, people running for state legislature, people running for community boards. And as a result, they, have this big bench that they could sort of rely on that slowly, built up in these states. And that's why I think you saw a culmination of Republicans taking over all these state houses. Democrats absolutely needed to match that. And I think Run for Something is helping with that. Another thing that I think is important is we need some fresh blood, in our politics today. We need some perspectives that aren't just, the usual political insidery things, but running for office is hard. Up until after the 2016 election, when groups like Run for Something came about, you sort of had to be a political insider to run for positions. And I've been really heartened by seeing the election results, in state elections like the 2017 in Virginia, in 2018 in the midterms, seeing people who walked into politics for the first time, who had no experience, no insider connections, really being able to connect and win these races for that precise reason, because they were much more in touch with the people they wanted to represent than, a lot of the status quo politicians that they were challenging. So thank you guys for all of your work. And I think one thing I just want to say before we kick this to questions, and I certainly want to spend most of the time here on questions, is I learned, the value, the power and the value of having a good communication strategy on Pete Buttigieg's presidential campaign. When he started running, he had no national fundraising base. He had no national name ID. And, to the traditional gatekeepers, and this is probably something you guys have heard a lot, they were like, who? Why are you running? You think you have a chance? It wasn't just David versus Goliath. It was David versus, like 20 Goliaths. But the one thing that we did realize that we had access to was the media. And that we had an ability to communicate in a different way with voters. And so what we tried to do is to understand the way that most politicians communicate with voters today is broken. It's ineffective. And I know no one here, I don't think is running for president, but I'll use this example and then we can sort of break it down from there, is that on the presidential level, for instance, the traditional way of running is you just go on cable news and you just talk to the same audiences over and over and over again. And as a result, you're sort of missing out on other audiences. You're missing out on other opportunities. And we made a commitment from the beginning to go everywhere, to meet voters where they are. Some of that was out of necessity, right? Like the New York Times wasn't exactly knocking down our door to talk to Pete. But as a result, because of that creativity, because we were willing to go on every podcast known to man, to go on every local radio show, every college, TV show, entertainment shows, sports shows, celebrity gossip oriented shows, we were able to sort of bust through and really meet and really talk to a lot of voters who otherwise wouldn't be tuned into the presidential race. And as a result, Pete ended up winning Iowa, and I think outperformed everyone's expectations. And I think what it goes to show you is that communications really matters. And it's gonna matter even more in the middle of a global pandemic, because if it was hard to get out your message before, it's even harder to get it out now. But I really, really do think that there are creative tactics that everyone here can employ. I think there are lessons that we can learn from candidates currently running. And there are some heartening signs. We saw increased, people are engaged. That's the good news, is in the middle of a global pandemic, people are engaged. We saw a really good turnout in Kentucky. We've seen really good turnout. All the votes haven't been counted yet, but in New York. So people are hungry. People are engaged. The pandemic has not stopped people from tuning into politics. And so so I'm interested in hearing from you guys and hopefully answering some of your questions about how you get your message out, how you speak with the media, how you make sure that voters are hearing your message even in the middle of these trying times.
Amazing. And hi, kitties. I know we have a couple of folks asking questions. I want to encourage people, if you have them, to drop them into the Q&A function or to leave a comment if you're watching on Facebook. I want to start with one that we were thinking about internally of how can local campaigns really effectively get the attention of the press, especially right now? Do you have any advice for them?
Well, you know, local campaigns, that's sort of like a broad category, but I think these are I think that there are a lot of creative things that you can be doing to get the attention of the media. And think about it this way, which is that if you are just doing politics as usual, if you are running in the middle of a global pandemic like you'd be running normally, the media probably isn't going to be that interested. But what I've seen and what I've looked at, and I wrote down some of this stuff, are some of the tactics that people have been doing. One is, okay, so we know that you can't do traditional town halls right now, but you can do socially distanced town halls. You can do Zoom town halls. You can do Zoom town halls or Facebook Lives or whatever it is that are broad and just sort of, you know, reaching out to all of your constituents, or you can do things that are more tailored by message. And you can be, you know, making sure that your campaign is helping voters in this moment, right? That you're doing check-in calls, you're texting people, you're doing you know, postcards, handwritten notes to make sure people are okay, make sure that they know you're out there. And if you share those details with the media and you share with them, hey, we're doing something different, we are, you know, making sure that we are connected in this challenging moment, I do think that the media will be interested, because this is a moment without precedent. It is a moment that there's no playbook for. And I really would just encourage people, especially if you're looking for media attention and trying to get people to pay attention, is to use this moment and use the just bizarre nature of it to really find new ways to you know, reach out to voters. And if you can do that, and if you're willing to experiment with that, I do think that the media will be really interested, because, you know, everyone is sort of curious about how we break through in this moment. And that's how I've so far really seen candidates be able to break through, is by using this bizarre moment to innovate.
Malika Matra, and I apologize if I butchered that last name, Malika, wanted to know, how do you recommend pitching specifically when working with a relatively unknown candidate?
So I think the most important thing to do is with media is to, and what races, can you tell me more about the race? Or
like, if you're in the chat and you want to share a little bit more about your campaign, we'd love to hear more.
And just generally what I would say is, you know, with media stuff, it is so specific to different levels, different races. So any context that you can give me would be super helpful, because I probably worked on that level of a race and probably have a sense of how it works, but it would help me, you know, answer, you know, better. Right.
Amazing. Well, why don't we wait and see if Malika is able to jump in the chat. In the meantime, Kyle Boyd is preparing to run a city council campaign against a long-term incumbent. Any communications tips for him?
Yeah, well, I think if you're running against a long-term incumbent, one, the first thing you've got to figure out is why, you know, is what is your rationale? What is your rationale against the incumbent? And what, you know, why are they deficient? And why you? And what is your message? And I think that's priority number one, I think, for any challenger, especially against a long-term incumbent. And then you go from there, right? You know, generally a long-term incumbent is going to have a long record. And so you getting all this sort of research together, getting your rationale together is really important. And then making sure that you are knocking the, no, God, you can't knock the doors, but making sure that you are really, that you are being as present as you can in this moment. I don't know when exactly your election is, but I think that for challengers, especially, you've got to be omnipresent. And we saw this recently in New York with the primary with Eliot Engel and Jamal Bowman, right? Eliot Engel was seen as this sort of, unbeatable long-term incumbent, and he was sort of resting on his laurels. But then Jamal Bowman was everywhere. He was everywhere, and Eliot Engel wasn't. And with generally, I think with long-term incumbents, and there are exceptions, is that they do get a little comfortable in their jobs. And I think people do love to see the hustle, and people who are omnipresent and working hard. And again, there are tactics that you can do to do that, even when you cannot be there physically. Some of the things I mentioned before, Zoom town halls, you can do Instagram lives, and it doesn't have to be with influencers. There are community groups that have started doing, community leaders or small business owners that have, sometimes sizable, sometimes small audiences where they broadcast out to their friends, their neighbors, talking about what matters to them that day. And so using their networks to get your message out is really important as well. And I would also just say, and maybe we can get to this with other things, is that I understand that there are a lot of communities where you don't have a lot of people on Instagram, where, maybe you don't always have the best internet connections, or they're older voters. And that's where I think you can still employ, tactics like teletown halls, postcards, just one-on-one phone calls. And those are as important as any of the, more modern tactics that we're talking about.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point of, if you're thinking about trying some of these tactics, I'll do a little plug here. You should go to resourcesforcampaigns.com. It's the hub where we've put together guides on how to do all of this, and examples for it. So if you're thinking, I really want to do a Zoom town hall, I want to do a press conference like this, we have step-by-step materials on how to technically put it together. Malika jumped back in with the clarification of primarily Southern progressives on the state House, state Senate level, thinking about pitching unknown candidates to the media.
Yeah, so the most important thing is to get the media interested, you got to offer up, an unknown candidate to the media, and get them in front of them as much as possible. Offer to bring them into TV stations, offer to bring them into news stations, because they're much more likely to get quoted in a story if the media has already met them. And I think if it's just you pitching them and, without any context, then it's going to be significantly more challenging. The other thing I would say, so one, making them as visible and as accessible is important. The second thing is this, is when you see news, when you see the local news covering an issue, if your candidate has an ability to speak on that issue, jump on it. Do it in a timely way. Call up the reporter, call up the news outlet and say, my candidate has something to say about this, would love to give you an interview about it. Put out a statement on it, tweet about it. And sometimes it won't happen overnight, right? And I sort of, this is not like a super sophisticated metaphor, but it really is a snowball effect with press. And I've seen it with every race I've worked on. Pete's campaign is certainly a perfect example, which is the more press you get, the more press you get, right? But the hardest thing is just starting to get any. And also make sure that bug the heck out of the press, make your candidate available, put out statements, but find opportunities to write op-eds, find opportunities to put out videos that TV stations could run, find opportunities to write letters to the editor. Even if, reporters might not initially call you, you can really force your way onto their radar screen. And I think that creative tactics are really helpful too. All of the things I ran ran before, and getting supporters to write in letters to the editor, to write comments online is really important, because then it shows that there's a groundswell of support for your candidate. But there's certainly no silver bullet. I think you really, really just got to hustle, work toward it, and but also figure out ways to make yourself newsworthy, right? And sort of play into the moment that we're in. But accessibility, I think, is really, 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 accessibility and being responsive is really, really important.
The best advice I ever got from a reporter that we worked with was that she was telling me, I have to do a job. I have to deliver content to my editor. I have to write a story. I have to find something. And if you don't, you can be a service to me by giving me that thing to write about. And I think that's something that candidates don't always, or even organizations don't always conceptualize if you're not used to working with reporters. They're people who have bosses and they have to deliver things, and you can be of service to them. Do you have any advice for people who are new to working with reporters specifically?
Well, look, I think you hit that nail on the head, which is that they have a job to do too. Newsrooms are increasingly starved. They have fewer resources, fewer reporters, especially when it comes to more local races. Local news, is dying, unfortunately. Although in certain areas there are alternative ways, alternative sort of sites that are popping up. Sorry, wait, what was I already forgot the question. It was
especially for people who are new to
work. No. Oh, yes. So is that to understand, it's really important to understand just sort of the rules of engagement in dealing with reporters. The basic thing, which is that if you're talking to a reporter, always assume everything you're saying could be printed in a newspaper, could be, run on air, anything like that. So you should understand the basic terms of, on the record, off the record, on background, things like that. But once you sort of understand that stuff, build a relationship with people. They have a job you have a tough job to do. They have a tough job to do as well. And I think, Amanda, what you said is really smart, is that you can serve as a resource for them, because they don't have a ton of resources. They're overstretched. And so when they're on deadline and they need a quote, you can give it to them. Your candidate can give it to them. When their editor is saying, get me an interesting story, they'll call. If you've built that relationship with them, if you've, had breakfast, lunch, dinner, coffee, drinks with them, they're much more likely to reach out to you and say, oh, I have a deadline. I don't have a story. What do you have for me? And so I think, and I think also making it so that an important thing too is having a relationship where it's not just the press reaching out to you, and it's not just you reaching out to the media and reporters only when you need them to do something for you. It's got to be a two-way street, right? And it's got to be where you check in, where you're checking in with them, and you're just, calling to maybe just say, after you see a good story that Brendan saying, wow, that was a great story. I thought it was really interesting. These are some other thoughts I have on it. And building a real human relationship. I think sometimes where people fall down in terms of press relations is thinking about it purely transactionally. I think you've got to understand that they're in a bind too on the other side of the equation. And just trying to be as easy and accessible to work with is really, really important. And also Amanda, just offering yourself up as a resource, not just like that you are trying to use them, but say, use me too. Like I'm here to help you.
Yeah, I think that's such a good way of conceptualizing a relationship with the press as opposed to adversarial, even though there can be adversarial ways to participate. Chelsea Mason asks, how does a candidate prep for an interview, particularly something on camera?
Yeah. So first of all, whether it's on camera or a print interview, always pull all the clips, pull all of the news of the day, try to get the topics that are likely to come up in the interview, and watch the last bunch of interviews that the reporter has done, read the last bunch of columns, whatever, that the reporter you're interviewing with has done, know where they're coming from, know what their bio is, so that you understand, you know, there's sort of a pattern to what people care about, how they do this. And there's a pattern to how people ask questions and all of that. And the best way, so once you have all of that, you know, I think it's really important to review the tape of, let's just focus in on TV stuff since that's what you asked about. Review the tape of previous interviews, as many as you can, as many that are sort of closest to what you've done. You know, you don't necessarily need to watch them, you know, interviewing a cat trainer, although clearly I need one. But interviews about that, and watch the news the week before, so that you know what's really getting, what's really animating that reporter, what's really animating the coverage on that station. Then the really, really, really important thing is practice. And you've got to do it where you sit down and you do mocks. You know, generally think of mocks as debates, but where you have a camera, where you sort of set up an interview sort of situation, and you sort of lob the questions at them in real time and have them respond, and have, you know, your candidate respond. And practice is a really important thing. And that's where you can practice a few different things. You can practice, you know, how they sit, where they're, you know, how they sit, where they're looking. And you can see some people have certain tics or, you know, verbal tics or physical that you can help work on camera. And you can also just get them more comfortable with the subject matter and with the rapid fire nature of TV interviews. It's also important to know whether something is live or whether it's taped. If it's live, you've got to, you know, you got one shot at this. If it's taped, candidates you can go on for a little bit longer and they'll cut it down into a package. So you've got a little bit more leeway there. But with TV stuff, it's just really, really important to drill. And, you know, and I think it's also helpful if you record it and have the candidate be able to watch the interview afterwards to see, oh, now, because sometimes we all have our own things that we might not see on camera, we might not understand exist. And it's, if with candidates, if they are able to see how they perform, then they can sort of, you know, adjust based on that. But really, it's all about practice.
I'll never forget the first time I did media training before I went on TV. Christina Reynolds sat down in a conference room with me for like 3 hours and filmed me while she was asking me questions. And every 20 minutes she would turn the camera back to me like, you can't make angry faces when they're asking you a question.
Right.
Like, even if it's a really dumb question, no, you can't make a frowny face.
Yeah.
It's hard. It's really hard. So.
It is hard, and it's scary, especially if people haven't done it before. But that's why I think that the practice can help. You know, it'll never be quite like what it's like when you're in an interview, but practice, and sometimes candidates really, really hate the practice. It's so annoying, but that's really the best way to do it.
I think that's right. Carrie Swartz wanted to ask about tips to best engage with Facebook, or how to create content that you think that might do well there. If you have any thoughts specifically about social media.
Yeah. Well, I think with any social media, I think that there's a lot of room for innovation. There's a lot of room for doing things differently. And I think, look, I would look to the candidates who have used Facebook Live well, who have, I don't know whether you're talking about live, you know, Facebook Live, or whether you're talking about sort of prepackaged content. But for me, one thing that I like about Facebook is I think it's really good. You know, I think it's good for reaching older voters. I think it's good for people sort of within their friend groups. And so you want, in terms of the content, yes, you definitely want shareable content that everyone can digest. But I'm obviously a big fan of doing sort of more community-oriented events on Facebook Live. And I think it's a really good way to sort of supplement the in-person campaigning that you could be doing right now. And using that as a way to sort of substitute for campaigning that we can't do right now. But, there's no recipe. I think just not overthinking things sometimes, and building up, it's really important to build up networks there too, to understand that we can't knock on doors right now. We can make phone calls, we can share things, but you can sort of deputize supporters of yours who would otherwise be knocking on doors to share content on Facebook, to share content on Twitter, to share content on Instagram, and to look at Facebook as sort of a substitute organizing tool. And honestly, maybe it will be in the future. Maybe we will see less in-person communications and more of that. But so if you have supporters who want to get involved, who want to get the message out, I would suggest telling them, become a sort of digital volunteer, digital organizing volunteer for us, and make sure that you are sharing the message of our campaign across Facebook, and have people who are, just as you'd set up precinct captains based on geographic areas, set up precinct captains for Facebook and other social networks.
I want to encourage people, if you have additional questions for Liz, to drop them in the Q&A function. And again, if you're just joining us, to make sure to change your chat settings to panelists and attendees, introduce yourself. James Sazanowski, again, I apologize if I butchered that, wants to talk a little bit about Youth Vote and about how you can best reach young people. If there's any tactics or techniques in terms of a communication strategy.
Yeah, well, this has been interesting too. So generally, I would say that campaigns still sort of traditionally and have struggled with that. You're not going to reach the youth vote by going on cable news, right? And that's the youth vote is a great example of where you really got to meet people where they are. Again, sort of what I was talking about, sort of deputizing supporters to do that. But one thing I saw that was used well in some of the New York primaries was for reaching younger voters was going to where they are, and younger voters, and it certainly depends on, where you're running, and you've got to look at where folks are sort of living online, but younger voters tend to live on social media. And so, a good example, I was talking to someone who was running here in New York, is that they realized that the best way to reach younger voters in their district, younger voters who usually tuned out politics, we're not watching New York One, we're not watching cable news, not reading the daily news, anything, was to go on Instagram. And to, do Instagram Lives where they would take questions from voters, to have good shareable content there, to do sort of, and with young voters, we sort of talk about it as a monolith, but I think one thing that's important to do is to understand and to use this moment to be more specific in who we're reaching out to, and to have sort of more, constituency-oriented events that sort of break down. You can do. I was talking to someone today who was saying, that. Canada, I can't remember who it was, did an event with like musicians, right? So where they could all sort of, play and play their instruments and share that. But but most importantly, it's meeting people where they are, and also using their platforms to speak to their groups. I think the idea that you're just going to use your own platform and reach people is not realistic. You've got to understand that, like, the best way sometimes to reach people is through other people's platforms, both big and small. And sometimes it's going to be time consuming. But when they bring you on, if you do an Instagram Live or whatever it is with them, they're giving you a sort of seal of approval. They're bringing you into a trusted group of their friends, and that's something that I saw personally. And again, it's New York. So Instagram was sort of the best way to reach people here. But I thought it was fascinating just how all the different tactics they used to do that, and how there wasn't just going on people with massive platforms. It was also making sure that they were sort of reaching out to people who just had, 20 friends that would go on.
Yeah, we're going to get more into digital comms later this summer, in a couple of weeks. But one thing I do want to make sure people think about, especially for campaigns, is go to a platform that makes sense for the candidate. Mm-hmm. The worst thing you can be is someone who is like the inauthentic participant in the social scene.
Exactly.
It's a good way to backfire.
And it's a candidate, but it's also just where we all know different communities people are tuned into different things. And so you've got to just sort of suss out what the best way is to reach. But I completely agree with that. Yes, you got to be authentic about it.
Oh, we have so many good questions. I'm going to try to get to as many as I can. Alina wanted to know, what are some frequent mistakes that you see candidates make? And a second question here, how do you balance the often complicated things between authentic, serious, and interesting for the media?
Oh, that's good. Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah.
So mistakes I see people make. One is being overly cautious and scared of the media. And that just doesn't, one thing I love about Run for Something is a lot of you guys are challengers. A lot of you guys are upstarts. A lot of you guys are younger. And guys, I use that in a gender neutral term, but, and so you've got to sort of play into that. You can't then just be scared of reaching out to the media, fearful of being burned, and sort of retreat to not being covered or retreat only to safe places. The way that people consume news now is so fractured that you've got to be willing to go everywhere. But that sort of leads, so being overly cautious to me is, and that's just sort of like a hallmark of my career, is being accessible, being available, going everywhere, because especially if you're a challenger, that's sort of how you win. But the second mistake I see people make is going out there without any preparation, and going out there and not having the background on the media outlet that they're talking about, not having all of the background on the issue that we're talking about. Sometimes candidates, I think media coverage is really important, but that doesn't mean that every media request that comes your way is something that you need to comment on. But when you do comment on it, you should be prepared. And so that means that you've got to make sure your candidates have media prep, that they are up to date on the likely topics, that they are aware of the media outlets, the reporters that they're interviewing with, because that will, sort of minimize the risk of sort of a gaffe or, a bad moment. And what was the second part of the question? It was, how do you balance those things of authenticity?
Being taken seriously and being newsworthy, being interesting.
Right, and it's, it's one of those things where you sort of know it when you see it. But I think being authentic is important. And traditionally, I think a lot of candidates go way too conservative and are really buttoned up, and it's only just like the talking points, and that doesn't connect with people. But at the same time, people, especially in the middle of a global pandemic, people don't want to see their elected officials like shotgunning beers and being completely unserious. So I think it's okay to show sides of your personality that don't necessarily fit into normal sort of what is conventionally accepted in politicians. We certainly did that with Pete. He would play instruments on air. For a long time, a lot of candidates wouldn't even speak foreign languages, right? It was seen as being too foreign or not American enough or whatever. And we let the sort of nerdy side of him come out. But you always want to, I think that people do like seeing humanity and personalities in candidates, but as long as it doesn't sort of undercut your seriousness, doesn't undercut, think about it this way. If you would be scared of seeing that an attack ad against you, don't do it, right? Think about the sort of worst case scenario. There still are ways to, I think there are ways to have fun. But the way I think I always sort of judge it is, could this be used in like a Trump attack ad? Could this be used in something like that? But you can't go too far to that extreme. And one thing I think that we are seeing, and Amanda, I think you can attest to this, is one of the reasons why younger people have been doing so well is because they are more authentic. They are more willing to sort of break the mold of these, like, you know, of what you think of as a politician. They live real lives. They've been on social media. You know, they cuss in interviews. That's okay. You know, they have a beer in an interview. That's also okay. But you know, you always want to keep in mind that you are running for a serious position, and you don't want to do anything that you could see coming back to haunt you.
That's a really good framework to think about as you show parts of your personality. Similar kind of question here, I guess a little bit different, from Kirk Vakovic. For challenges for candidates who don't have political or government backgrounds, are there certain topics you feel like they're more likely to get grilled on or they should lean into more?
Yeah, for people who don't have backgrounds, it's, well, you know, then how do you think that you can bring about, and how do you think that you can bring about change? How do you think that you know how to govern? That's the number one question that you'll get grilled on. The good news is this, is that most people don't really prioritize government experience. I think it might be changing a little bit right now. And I think actually Biden is sort of testing that, right? Because generally you think of everyone hates politics, they want outsiders. But so to be able to apply, you know, either your life experiences, things you've, what you've done for jobs, you know, things that you've seen. So to be able to sort of put those things into a framework that applies, right? So why they're motivating you to run for office and why they would make you a good elected representative. And I don't think most people care, frankly, whether you've been in hearings or whether you've, you know, introduced a resolution. You just have to present a rationale for why you and why you're running. And so it is always really, really important to connect your life experiences, the things you've done, to the moment you're in and to the office that you're in. Again, think back to 2018. There are a lot of, you know, younger people who won congressional races, you know, people who'd been nurses, teachers, didn't necessarily have traditional political backgrounds. But if you're a nurse, you can talk about how broken our healthcare system is and what you saw up close. Yeah, sure, you weren't in congressional hearings, but you don't need a congressional hearing to understand all the problems that we have and that we need to fix. I mean, you were on the front lines of it. If you were a veteran, and you know, veterans certainly for years dealt with this, which is even just going into the workforce, which is, well, what's your experience? You've seen up close sort of, you know, the flaws of our foreign policy, but also have developed a ton of leadership skills and ability to deal with tough situations under pressure. If you're an educator, you've seen up close, you know, the challenges, I mean, so many different things, but certainly the challenges in our schools of underfunding our schools and all of those different things. So I think sometimes the personal stories of people who are compelled to run, who aren't in politics, are really powerful. What was the second part of that question? Sorry,
no, I think you covered this.
Yeah.
If there's any topics that you think someone without government background might get grilled on, but I think you covered it.
No, I think it's just that, like, oh, so you don't have government experience. And one thing I would say is just lean into it. Most people don't think that politicians are great. You know, look at Congress's approval ratings. And even, I mean, local government generally is more trusted, but even state houses have a lot of challenges today. And so don't use it as a strength, use it as a positive, don't view it as a negative. And I think that not having traditional political experience, not having traditional government experience should be a selling point for you, and something that makes that you should use to make the case that you're more in touch with what people experience every day, and it should never be something that puts you on your back heel.
I love that. Patrick Mailer says, I'm thinking of running for mayor in Yonkers, New York after he finishes undergrad. Any tips on starting a media network or starting a relationship with the press if you're young, if you're new to the scene, and you're maybe running a year or 2 years down the road?
Yes. Oh, that's awesome. Well, that's cool. I'm from Bronxville, New York originally, so very familiar with Yonkers. Yeah, so few things that are important is you try to get involved with local stuff as much as possible, local causes, local organizations, you know, any community-oriented things that you can is really important. And, you know, it's so much easier to deal with reporters if you've reached out to them before you started running for office. They might not always say, yeah, that they'll have time to sit down with you, but if you're doing things in your community, just set up time to talk with them. Also make sure that you are visible, you know, visible in the community. You can write letters to the editor, with local publications, you know, be on Nextdoor, be on Facebook, be on all of these things. And the media is more likely to cover you if you are visible, if they do see that you're out there, you know, present in the community on different important causes. Go to community meetings where the media is going to be, and if you have something that is compelling to say, important to say, and speak up and make sure to introduce yourself to them there. Do not do that if you don't have something compelling or important to say. You know, don't just do it for the sake of doing that. But I think if you can build that relationship with the media before you've started running, it's going to be a better relationship overall because it'll be more organic and seem, you know, sort of less transactional.
Switching gears a little bit, Charles Zakin, and again, I apologize. For those with no political experience that want to get involved with campaigns, not as candidates, but as staff, any advice on breaking into the field?
Yes. Well, geez, that is look at the local races that are, figure out what you want. Well, one, figure out what your strengths are, what you really like doing. And, you know, everyone's got to sort of work their way up from the bottom. I was a senior advisor to a presidential candidate on communications. I ran his debate prep. I oversaw all of his communications and, you know, message strategy and all of that stuff. But, you know, I didn't start there. I started out as a field organizer. I started out as a field volunteer, knocking on doors, writing letters to the editor, making phone calls. But think about, okay, these are maybe the areas of politics I would want to go into, and then go from there. I think, and be realistic about the fact that you're going to have to start at the bottom of the ladder, at the bottom rung. And probably the easiest way is and how I got started is, you know, I got started by interning for the state party in New Hampshire. But looking at what your local opportunities are and getting your foot in the door there. Also local races, smaller races, you're more likely, if you do a good job, if you work hard, they'll give you more responsibilities. They don't have as many resources, anything like that. So if you have, you know, if there is a city council race, if there is a, you know, state house, state senate race, if there is a congressional race, that's a really, really good training ground, or, you know, mayoral race, really good training ground for getting your foot in the door. But I think if you are willing to put in long hours, understand that it's not going to be glamorous, people generally will recognize that. And on campaigns, I know when I've seen volunteers who are willing to do all that hard work and put in extra time, or, you know, younger staffers who are on their first campaigns, that it is, or new, not even just younger, but new time staffers who are willing to hustle and really commit themselves to work, that they stand out. And if you do that, the more work you're willing to get. But it's a slog. No one goes from 0 to 60 that quickly in politics. But I think look around at local races that interest you.
Yeah, it's like we tell folks, when you show up to volunteer, if the best thing you can do for the campaign is clean the bathroom, then clean the bathroom.
Exactly.
Really interesting question from Stratton McKenzie. How do you think about the weight of social versus traditional media, especially as it relates to sort of like our pandemic and hopefully one day post-pandemic world?
Well, so it depends. It depends on the level of race that you're working for. It depends on the district that you're running in, the area that you're running in. So let me give you 2 examples that show you how different it is, right? So on the presidential campaign, right? The first example is social media sometimes not being as important as you think it is. The second one is more important. On the presidential campaign and sometimes national politics, I think a lot of political staffers and sometimes candidates get way too caught up in what the social media conversation is, primarily on Twitter. And they let that really dictate what they're doing and sort of dictate their decision making and throw them really off their message. But most people aren't on Twitter. It is a very elite conversation. It is a lot of insiders. It's a lot of people in the media. And we did see it distorting the political conversation a bit. And I think the candidates who did better, oftentimes, Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, Pete, were people who weren't captive to every utterance on Twitter, every trending topic. And I think it's important to understand, and I think that's more on the presidential level, but sometimes social media can really distort what the public really cares about and throw you off your game. So it's not everything. What I would say, though, it is really important, especially in the middle of a pandemic, it is really important on races where it might be more of a challenge to get traditional media coverage. And it's more important now than it was, 4 months ago, because you can't hold traditional town halls, right? You can't knock on doors. You can't be visible in your community the same way that you would have been. Your volunteers can't be either. And so I do think that you can use, again, I would use, this is not Twitter, this is more, things like, Zoom, Instagram Live, Facebook, where you can use those to sort of supplement what in-person campaigning was. So you have digital organizers, but you also hold creative events there. You hold issue-specific town halls. You can hold geographic-specific town halls. You can bring in, one thing that I think is cool about this moment with what you can do with social media is that a lot of times, and the Biden campaign is a good example, is that they would do an event with a special guest, but only people in that surrounding area can get into that event. Now everyone can see Joe Biden with Barack Obama. Everyone has the same access. And so you can bring everyone in that way. And I think that it is a really, really important moment for innovation. And it's not just about social media. If you are doing something really interesting to talk with voters, make sure that you are inviting media to this, right? Make sure that every one of these voter contact events, whether it's, town hall, Instagram Live, whatever it is, make sure that the media is invited to all of them. Make sure that you're pitching, if you've done a bunch of really cool things, make sure that you're sending them out to the media so that they're aware of what you're doing, because I do think it is really newsworthy to folks in the media to see this is how people are campaigning right now. And social media platforms are so essential, I think, in this current moment.
Okay, second to last question. Kyle, who's been talking about city council races, has another really good question about how to hire communications folks, especially people with experience. If you're a first-time candidate or a local candidate, do you have any advice for people trying to hire comm staffers?
Yeah, so look, it obviously helps to have people who have some experience or there are few, okay, let me take a step back. What are the things that you should be looking for in a communications staffer? You want someone who can write well. You want someone who sort of understands the basics of how the media works. What are the media outlets that you're reaching out to? How do various social media platforms work? I think some of it too has got to be just about your personal chemistry with someone, right? If you are a hard charging, I want to go on everything, I want to attack everyone, blah, blah, blah. It is very good to have sort of a counterbalance in your communication staffer. Similar, if you're very cautious, I think it's very good to have someone who's a little bit more hard charging. It's such an important role, and it's such a public facing role that you do want someone who I think can sort of check your impulses. But writing skills are important, and understanding of the media is important. So, but sometimes, look, I've hired people on campaigns who didn't have any prior experience, but they generally did have, a good ability to write, some sort of background in this to do it. I do think you always want to find a good balance, though, of that, because one thing that you see sometimes is candidates when they go with someone who's too much like they are, you go in very bad, either too cautious, too aggressive, all of that. But spend some time with them, see what their thoughts are, see where they would take your campaign. So ask them to produce a communications plan for you. Ask them to produce, a few examples of events that they would hold for you. Ask them to give you ideas of op-eds or press release. Give them some exercises to do, and then see which of those people sort of fits what you need the most. But communications is hard. It's different. There's no exact way to do it. And so I think for me, when I hire people, I always do like to see how they perform when I throw something at them.
Last question. What's the worst advice you've ever heard someone give a candidate, or you've ever tried to discourage a candidate from taking?
The worst advice, God. I remember during Pete's campaign, some of the more traditional people around him, or traditional gray hairs in politics, were criticizing him for doing too much media, being too out there, being too accessible, like as if that's a thing. I think that comes to mind because it was the most recent thing, but it was bad to me for a few reasons. One, like that was how Pete became a factor in the race, was doing that. But two, it was also based on an old view of politics, right? Which is that you do things all a certain way, and you only go on Meet the Press to communicate. You only talk to the New York Times, you don't go talk to TMZ Live, you don't talk to sports outlets, you don't go on whatever it is. And generally, I think to broaden that out, the issue that I have sometimes with bad communications advice is it's based on things in the past, the way things have always been done, and the terrain of communications, the terrain of the way that voters consume their news, the different ways that candidates can communicate and get their message out is always changing. And I'm always very skeptical of anyone who says, you can't do that because that's never been done before. You can't do that because that's too different. And the worst advice I think so that's the thing, is the worst advice I've heard is the advice that, you should just do things the way they've always been done, and, stop taking so many risks. And I think that's especially important for, the folks who are involved with Run for Something, because if you listen to that advice, if you are a first-time candidate, if you are a challenger, if you are a young upstart, you're not going to break through by doing things the way they've always been done. And the way I think that young upstarts break through, the way that first-time candidates break through, people challenging long-term challengers, is by showing that the way things have always been done is broken. And the reason why you are here, the reason why you're running for office, is because you're not going to do things the way they've always been done. And a good way of showing that is by how you communicate with the public.
That's great. And what a good note to end on. Thank you, Liz, for asking these questions or answering these questions. Thank you to so many folks who wrote in with really smart questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. I want to remind you, we're going to be doing this every Wednesday night, all summer long. Every night, 6 p.m., every Wednesday, 6 p.m. East Coast, 3 p.m. Pacific. We're going to have different topics every week. So if you're watching now, if you're on Zoom, and thank you to the many, many folks who jumped on Zoom. If you're watching on Facebook, sign up and keep joining us. The conversation is going to be as awesome and as interesting and as really helpful to candidates as we hope this one was tonight. So thank you again, Liz, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Bye.